It all began with one bold political soundbite. "We don't need their wood." What sounded like a proud declaration of independence quickly became the spark that reshaped an entire trade relationship. The moment the U.S. decided it could get along without Canadian lumber, a chain reaction began, a chain that would ripple across construction sites and housing markets, even into global supply chains. At first, it seemed like a move of strength, a confident flex of economic self-reliance. But beneath the rhetoric lay a dangerous gamble, and it didn't take very long for the cracks to show. Within weeks, America was already paying the price. It also came at a time of rising protectionism, wherein the federal government was doing all in its power to bring jobs back, rejuvenate industries at home, and show that the country could be self-sufficient. Lumber was no exception. So, the administration rolled out new national security tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, aiming to make imports pricier and give U.S. producers an edge. Simple in theory, but disastrous in practice. Almost overnight, the prices of lumber exploded to over $650 per thousand board feet, a high not seen in years. Across the country, construction projects slammed on the brakes. Builders stopped. Developers scrambled. The price of raw materials had suddenly jumped, and no one knew when or if it would calm down. For families chasing the dream of owning a home, that dream drifted further out of reach. Analysts from the National Association of Home Builders warned that each $10,000 increase in home prices could push millions of Americans out of the housing market altogether. And here's the part no one could spin. The U.S. imports about a third of its lumber, and nearly 85% of that comes directly from Canada. So, when tariffs hit Canadian imports, the blow landed squarely on America's own housing supply chain. This wasn't just a tariff on foreign wood, it was a tax on every nail, beam, and plank that held the housing market together. Even if every American sawmill ran full tilt, experts estimated the U.S. would suffer a shortfall of more than 3 billion board feet. Domestic mills simply couldn't make up the gap. Most already were running at 95% capacity, and besides, the equipment was old and labor in short supply. It was like asking a car to go faster while taking its engine apart. The results were visible from coast to coast, in Texas to Ohio to Florida. Construction sites fell silent, materials became scarce, and new home prices outpaced wage increases. For every 1% lumber price increase, $1,000 was added to the final cost of a home. At the peak of around $765 per thousand board feet, buyers paid upwards of $10,000 more for the same house. Literally, no upgrades, no extras, just more money for the same wood and nails. But while American families were tightening their budgets, something surprising was happening north of the border. Canada didn't retaliate. They adapted. Rather than retaliate with tariffs, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a $500 million program to help the softwood lumber industry diversify away from the U.S. market. It was a calm, strategic response, and it changed everything that came next. Shortly after the launch of Canada's first relief package, the federal government doubled down, announcing another 1.2 billion Canadian dollars, approximately $870 million USD, to shield lumber producers from anti-dumping duties and open fresh doors to new international markets. British Columbia's Minister of Forests, Ravi Parmar, had set an ambitious target of diverting at least 10% of lumber exports away from the United States. That was more than just reached, it was shattered. Across the provinces, regions once dependent on surefire U.S. demand started looking outward. Canadian producers began forging partnerships in Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Japan alone increased its Canadian lumber imports by more than 26% in early 2024. New trade deals followed. Germany and South Korea signed contracts, while the European Union leaned in on Canada's reputation for sustainability and responsible forestry. But at home, a quiet revolution was underway. Mills across Western Canada began transforming. moving beyond the old model of raw lumber exports, churning out engineered wood, furniture-grade timber, and higher-value products that could weather global price swings. The ports in Vancouver and Prince Rupert expanded and modernized, and trade missions multiplied. Each shipment wasn't just about profit anymore, it was about identity. Canada was no longer just America's lumberyard. It was stepping onto the world stage as a global player in sustainable timber. Meanwhile, across the border, the U.S. story took a very different turn. The tariffs that were supposed to protect American jobs weren't creating them. Domestic mills were still struggling to ramp up. Builders were out of patience. Projects were either delayed, redesigned, or outright canceled. And the pain did not stop at housing. It started bleeding into the broader economy. Material costs climbed, renovations slowed. Infrastructure budgets blew past projections. The verdict from economic think tanks was candid. Tariffs on lumber don't protect industry. They just make everyday Americans poorer. The data proved it. As Canada was out there, energetically expanding its markets and upgrading its technology, the U.S. was busy explaining why homes remained unaffordable, even as interest rates dropped. Ironically, the same tariffs that spurred U.S. builders also fueled Canada's transformation. Higher prices translate into higher revenues for Canadian firms like West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor, which reinvest in innovation, automation, and sustainability. They weren't just bouncing back, they were evolving. Global buyers started to view Canadian lumber as dependable, renewable, and ready for the future. Green steel for a climate-conscious age. Lumber wasn't just wood anymore. It was a symbol of independence, innovation, and trust. By 2025, Canada's lumber exports outside the U.S. had jumped almost 20%. This was not some side project, but a strategic pivot. A clear redefinition of what Canadian trade stood for: diversified, dynamic, and resilient. Canadian forestry companies no longer feared the next U.S. policy shift, because they had options. And in international commerce, options are power. Meanwhile, America was facing a reality it could no longer ignore. Even with the imposition of tariffs, domestic supply could not meet demand. Even when prices rose, sawmills were unable to scale quickly enough. The cost of independence became the price of limitation. The dream of self-sufficiency came with a cost far higher than anyone expected. And it wasn't just measured in dollars. It came in the form of missed opportunities, stalled developments, and families watching their hopes of home ownership drift away. Every attempt to justify the policy ran into the same problem. There was no quick fix. Building new mills takes years. Training skilled workers takes even longer. And with the still lingering supply chain disruptions echoing from the pandemic years, every delay turned into a dead end. What was once a patriotic plan to save American jobs had now unraveled into the cold, hard reality that the system was a lot more fragile than previously thought. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada didn't just recover, it reinvented itself. What was at first an emergency adjustment now became a national strategy of diversification. Sustainability wasn't a buzzword any longer, but a competitive advantage. Under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, Canadian timber firms had supported new sustainability benchmarks, framing wood not just as a commodity, but as the solution to global carbon reduction goals. Investments in green technology surged. Canadian manufacturers began producing engineered wood for high-rise buildings, prefabricated modular homes, and climate-resilient construction materials. Industries once dominated by Scandinavia and Central Europe. The goal wasn't just to survive U.S. tariffs. It was to leapfrog them, to turn a short-term challenge into a long-term edge. And by all accounts, it was working. The real story, though, lay in what didn't happen in the United States. Yet, despite the tariffs, there was no great revival in the American forestry sector. Equipment remained outdated. Labor shortages persisted, and mills that had shut down decades ago stayed shuttered. The theory behind protectionism was running head-on against logistical reality. Because the truth is, you can't tariff your way to growth if you don't have the infrastructure to support it. The story had become one of contrast. One country reacted with force, the other replied with foresight. One tried to build walls, the other built bridges. And that difference showed up everywhere, not just in the trade numbers, but in the daily experiences of builders and families, exporters and policymakers. As the demand for sustainable materials grew globally, the position of Canada was only getting stronger. Investment in modernization, international outreach, and environmental standards allowed Canada to turn itself into more than just an alternative supplier. It became a trusted partner, reliable, climate-conscious, and politically stable. In other words, a nation synonymous with high-quality, sustainable lumber. It was more than an economic pivot. It was a recasting of identity. Analysts with RBC anticipate that by 2027, if the current trends keep pace, Canada could become the largest lumber export hub outside of Northern Europe. And that's not just about dominance, it's about design, the conscious effort to evolve, adapt, and lead instead of simply reacting. Because in the end, Canada didn't just survive a trade war, it rewrote the playbook. And as for the United States, reverberations of those tariffs can still be felt. Housing affordability remains under pressure. Supply chain gaps haven't fully healed. Builders remain reluctant to take great risks. And while the economic fallout hasn't been catastrophic, it has been stubbornly persistent. The much-promised revitalization of American industry never truly materialized. In the end, the price of independence proved to be another thing altogether: interdependence, only with fewer choices and at greater cost. But this isn't the story of heroes versus villains. It's a story about assumptions, about what happens when a nation oversimplifies a deeply complex relationship. But the United States thought it could unplug just one part of its economy and replace it at its whim, and nothing else would happen. But there are no clean breaks when trade routes twist across continents and supply chains that link whole economies. Just consequences. And those repercussions ripple. The lesson herein is simple yet profound. Strength doesn't always come from standing alone. Sometimes it's about knowing which partnerships to preserve and how to make them stronger. Canada learned that lesson. It took what could have been a crisis and turned it into a catalyst for transformation. Where others build walls, Canada built bridges. While the U.S. looked inward, Canada looked outward. And in doing so, found something far more powerful than protection. It found momentum, and that momentum is still carrying it forward. Thanks for watching.